Andy, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since chatting with you previously and knowing some of your life path, I've been very intrigued to have this conversation today.
Thanks, Mark. It's an absolute pleasure.
So, as you're aware, Andy, how I begin this is with the question of, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Uh, well, I think as I explained to you previously, I've had quite what my father calls as a rich tapestry of life, which is a very diplomatic way of saying, sometimes it's been a bit chaotic. Uh, and I think when I reflect back on the experiences I've had, uh, that there's been a consistency. And I mean, it took me until probably I was into my late 40s before I truly found what my purpose was. And when I found that purpose, which is basically helping others, to put it very simply, there becomes moments in your life when you do help others, and there becomes moments as you get older when maybe you're not as fit and virile as you were in your 20s and 30s. And sometimes that burden of helping others can be quite much. So it's how do you find that balance? Now I know, having worked in the police for 30 years, I never achieved what people would say is a work-life balance. Never. I hold my hand on my heart and said I really struggled with that. For me, policing, and I was very fortunate that I did my most of my policing career in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, where it is very different to urban policing. It's for me, it's a style of policing that is led by the community. That community consent, where you live and you work within the community. I know that's very different nowadays, but certainly I was very fortunate to experience that. And a lot of the times when you work by yourself or you work in really small teams, you never have the resources. So you work with the community during really difficult times of adversity, uh, and the community always know who you are and what you're about. So I remember that the first time I went to the Isle of Barra and Outer Hebrides as a young constable, thinking that nobody would know anything about me. They knew exactly how old I was, where I came from, the car registration, the type of car that I had before I even arrived in the island. And you think to myself, well, I remember going to the island of Battersea to teach the children stranger danger. And I went across in the boat and then got picked up in the community minibus and went to the school. And when you're a stranger in these small islands, everybody wants to know why you're there and why you've come to this small island. So it was a very, very different take. And a lot of these experiences when I was younger in my police service probably shaped in terms of how I respond to a lot of different things in my new career in the humanitarian world. And it's, for me, I sometimes feel that I am a guide when I go to some of these places. You go into a different country, maybe you go into Africa uh, or the Far East or some other places where it is really, really difficult. And I always try to be really respectful because I'm in somebody else's country, uh, and I'm there to offer my guidance, not to tell them what to do. And sometimes that can be quite a fine balance when you go with maybe younger staff that don't have that life experience, that say, oh, we need to answer all these questions because we need to fill out this form and we need to do this and we need to do this. And that actually puts them in the position where they don't actually listen. And my experience of helping to do the set up the mission in Nigeria, we went to a quite a remote area outside one of the villages, where all the people that have been displaced by Boko Haram were living, basically living in the bush. And they came to meet us in a dilapidated school. There was no roof in it. It was quite badly damaged from a storm. And of course, being the eldest and having grey hair and being tall, the elders wanted to speak to me, and I had younger staff with me. And my team leader had a sheet of paper with about 20 questions on it, and he says, "I need to ask all these questions." And I said, "Can I just maybe get you to put that away?" I says, let's talk to them. Let's find out." And part of my experience from being in the islands came racing back to me, because here I am in a different continent, in a different country, where exactly the same principle applied. They knew exactly who I was, why we were there, what we intended to do. So I didn't talk to them about why we were there. I talked to them about farming, because they were all farmers. I've had the pleasure of working on crofts in the Highlands of Scotland during the winter, which is really brutal in terms of working with Mother Nature to try and look after livestock and all these various other things. And we talked about farming, we talked about family, and as I got towards the end of our discussion, where I did most of the listening, I said to the elder, I said, "No, I need to hand you over to our team leader. He will explain why we're here." And he very calmly said, he says, "Oh, Mr. Brown, we know why you're here. We're here and you're hoping to rebuild the school. I have a list of all the pupils, all their different levels, primary 1 to primary 7. And on the back of the piece of paper, I've got all the teachers in the community and all their different qualifications and their specialisms in terms of what they teach." And the team leader looked at me and he goes, "Wow, we've managed to get all that information without asking a single question." And I said, for me, and I said, the lesson is being present in the situation, and really listening to these people. These people have been displaced from their homes because of violence. Some of these families had young girls, children, killed because they went to school. And you sit there and you think, well, I can't begin to imagine what that's like. And to be there in that space, to be respectful and to say, right, this is what we're going to try and do. We're going to work with you. We're not here to impose, but we're going to work with you to try and rebuild and support your community. And sometimes that can be quite a difficult conversation, because you need to be able to manage the expectations. You don't come with tons of resources. You come with a few resources, and to say, well, how can we work with you to do these things? And my experience with working with people that have been displaced by violence or refugees is that a lot of them, they don't want handouts. They want the skills to be able to manage their life by themselves. And I actually feel very blessed that within a policing career, I got tons of skills. Policing, certainly when I did it, they invested a huge amount of money into officers and the different skill sets that you would develop. And I got towards the end of my career, and I became quite ill. I'd gone to hospital for elective surgery, which went really badly wrong. In fact, it almost killed me. And I physically recovered from that quite quickly, thanks to the health service. Psychologically, I found it quite tough, because as a police officer, and maybe it's a Scottish thing that you think you're fairly invincible, and I'm going to go out there and protect the community, and nothing can knock me down. And by jingo, I was knocked completely on my backside, and it took the wind out my sails, and it took me. I could run in the mountains for miles and never break sweat. I was really fit for the hill. I did a lot of deer stalking, so I was really fit and strong. And then suddenly to go from that place where you're really strong to suddenly thinking, right, I can barely walk 20 yards without needing to sit down to get my breath back is quite debilitating, physically, mentally. It was a real struggle. But as my mother said, one of the things I was blessed with was being thrown. So it's strong-willed and strong-minded, sometimes a bit stubborn. Uh, and I thought, right, I need to build that strength back up, and I did that. And then I thought, just as I'd come out of that physically, I then got whacked with chronic fatigue. So chronic fatigue is basically, I suppose the doctor described to me, it's like a car battery. Your car battery is completely drained, and no matter how often you charge it, it doesn't quite get back up to full power. And that affects your ability to concentrate, to write to the same standard, to do your work to the same standard. And there's a whole pile of frustrations come with that. Now, my doctor, who's a good friend, said to me, she said, Andy, you're approaching the end of a 30-year career. You've done really tons of stuff. He said, when I sit and listen to you and the things that you do, I'm almost exhausted. And he was about 15 years younger than me. He says, because he said, the way that you talk and the things that you do, he said, it's like you're on the train and you want to get off the train and you want to push the train to its destination. And he says, that's really hard work because a train's really big and it's really heavy. And I thought, okay. He says, maybe you just need to actually enjoy the journey. And I thought, oh. I said, I really understand that. I've worked in a career where saying no is not really something that we do. You're given orders and you carry it out. It's very task driven. You deal with crisis a lot. So I then went to my boss in probably my last year of policing, and he says, I want you to do all these things. And I thought, okay. And I said, I'm going to say something that's going to surprise you. And I said, it's no. And he was actually very, very good. And he said, okay, why? So I was able to explain, chronic fatigue. And I said, physically, I might look fine, but inside, I'm just a bit of a mess. So he was very good, and I came out of that, transition out of the police, and I think as I said to you previously, my half of my career was as a hostage crisis negotiator, and as my instructor said to me, I'll be back in 2001. Andy's a big, gentle giant who's very tactically aware, and I got lots of really high pressure scenarios and incidents that I dealt with. And the consistent thing was that in that space of crisis and chaos, I'm really calm. And I feel very blessed. I'm able to do that. I get really focused on what I'm doing. And I'm able to guide people through that chaos out the other side. And I was really fortunate that I was able to do a lot of studies round about negotiation. I spent time in the States working with FBI, working with NYPD, the US Marshal Service. And I learned from every place that I went. And what I learned is, in terms of the skills that we were taught as negotiators, is that the principles that we use and the models that we use to actively listen, to empathise, to build rapport, and then influence and persuade people into a different course of behaviour is a really powerful skill. And what I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I left the police. And I remember being on a flight down to London, and I was sitting next to a guy who had been in the special forces for years, and he was going down to London, and his advice to me was, and this guy was a complete stranger, his advice to me was, when are you going to retire? And I says, well, by this time I had about 2 years to go. And he says, my advice to you, Andy, he says, start the plan now so that you don't fall off a cliff edge and that you transition smoothly. You know, what are your skills? What are you going to do? And I took that seriously. The studies that I did into negotiation allowed me to lecture in different parts of the world. To the military, to policing, and to academia. And I was able to build up credibility. I started writing about it, and ended up, being on the advisory council for the Crisis Response Journal. And then I went down to London, and you'll relate to this story. So I was in London talking about kidnap, and in the audience was somebody from UK government, and I challenged them about how we responded from a UK policing perspective to different types of international kidnap. Because at that point we had responded to the In Amenas gas plant attack in Algeria as UK Policing PLC, and it was a very professional response. And then within the same month, we responded to a Scottish captain being kidnapped in the Niger Delta, and it was a completely different response. It was, no, don't worry, insurance companies will take care of that. And I'm saying, but wait a minute, this is the same crime. Okay, one's covered by insurance, one's not. But we shouldn't respond differently. And at that conference, I met an Irishman called Morris. And Morris and I, did the usual thing at these conferences. We chat, we had a coffee, exchanged cards, and he said, oh, can you train negotiators? I said, yeah. I said, I've been training negotiators for a long time. I'm happy to help do that, if that's what you want. And then we parted ways, and I went back home and continued to do my work in policing. And then just as I transitioned my career out, I got a phone call from Morris. I was back in London. My wife, it was at the garden party with her brother. He'd managed to blag a ticket, and I was left to my own devices. So went off to the Lord's Cricket Ground with some submariners, which is always a bad thing because we had a few pints. And I got a phone call from Morris, and this was about 2 years later. And he said, "Oh, do you remember me?" I said, "Yeah, I remember you." And he says, "We've got a priest kidnapped in Afghanistan. Can you help?" And I went, "Yeah, I can help with that." And he says, "Okay," he says, "in 15 minutes' time, Father Peter from Rome is going to phone you." Now, I sort of looked at the phone and I was thinking, nah, this is just a wind-up. And he says, "No, it's not a wind-up, Andy. He's going to phone you." And then, true enough, Father Peter phoned me. I scrabbled about, found a piece of paper, wrote down some notes, and said to Peter, "I want you to do, X, Y, and Z." And I said, "I'll be in Rome within a couple of days." And I went over to Rome a couple of days later. I sat down with the Jesuits. Never worked with the Jesuits before. I never had that experience. I was introduced as Mr. Brown, the expert kidnapper, which I thought was hilarious. And then was frog marched over to the gendarmerie within the Holy See. I met the head of the gendarmerie and said, "Oh, we've opened a case file," and handed me an empty folder. And I'm thinking, okay, right, I get this. I've got to do everything. So from that moment on, I trained a team in Herat in Afghanistan. And we negotiated until we made contact and got proof of life. And we continued that negotiation for 8.5 months until we got the priest released from captivity. And for me, where was I when that happened? When he was released, I was in church. So my phone was going mad in my back pocket. And I stepped out of church and got the good news that he'd been released, which was fantastic. And he'd been relatively well looked after because we were able to get the Taliban to look after him. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's maybe just a coincidence. I was in church. Didn't think much of it. I then go back to Rome to do a debrief, and Father Peter takes me to St. Peter's Basilica at night, and we sat and we prayed. And then he turned and looked at me, and he just said to me, he says, Andy, you came from nowhere, and you've guided us from the darkness into the light. And it honestly felt like a bolt of lightning had hit me. And I'm thinking, right, I know what I'm meant to do, and that's help others. And it just really confirmed, that world question: why are we here? What's our purpose? And for me that was a defining moment for me. I sometimes get a little bit emotional about it, because I could go off and work with other NGOs and probably make lots more money. But for me, it's not about that. It's about helping others, and being able to act as that guide when you go through adversity or crisis. Sometimes you need that shepherd to hold your hand and to walk you through that adversity. And what I've learned from the world of hostage negotiation within policing and law enforcement, my good friend Jack Cambria, who was the head of the hostage unit in NYPD, when he was recruiting negotiators, he deliberately wanted men and women that had experienced pain in their life. Heartache, maybe being in trouble with the law or through the courts, maybe having a really tough upbringing, having experienced poverty, etc. Having experienced some sort of pain. And because that gives you an advantage when you are trying to connect with people that are that might be in a similar space. And if you have the courage to be vulnerable and to share some of your own pain, it can allow you to connect with somebody because you've maybe got a deeper understanding of what the pain is that they're suffering. And I can give examples of that I experienced. I haven't come through policing. I'm very, I don't know whether you would say unfortunate or fortunate, but I've had 2 divorces, which my lawyer at the time said to me, he says, Andy, regard your life as a book, and you have different chapters in that book. And he said, the key to life is to having more good chapters than bad. He says, you're in a bad chapter just now. Let's try and make it short. And that was really good advice. And I've come through 2 divorces, and it's taken me these 2 divorces to find my wife, and to find someone that I truly connect with and deeply love. And I've got 4 children. My eldest is 32. My youngest is 9. and I've got two at 16 and 17 in the middle. And if I look at societal norms, is it normal? Probably not. Do I care? No, because I am who I am. And if I look back at my life, sometimes you think, when I separated from my first wife, I spent every waking hour trying to see my son, to spend quality time with him. And always at the back of your head, you think, oh, I'm going to feel guilty that I didn't do it right, I didn't stay in the marriage, and all these societal things that we feel pressured to do. But I felt very strongly that, his mother and I didn't get on, and I didn't want him to be in a relationship where we were constantly fighting and for him to be miserable. It would be better for us to be apart, and to continue to love him, and to bring him up. And when he was 21, I took him out for a pint and sat down with him and said, as your dad, I want to ask you a question. Do you feel that you had a good upbringing? And to my surprise, he says, I had a great upbringing. He says, yeah, your mum didn't get on. He says, but that was okay. He says, but you poured all your love into me. He says, and talked about the camping we used to go on and all the things that we did. And he says, I feel very fortunate to have that upbringing that I have had. And for me, I just felt, phew, okay, well, maybe I've got something right in my life. And the middle two children, very different relationship. And I saw them, I hadn't really been allowed to see them for about 5 years, which I really struggled with. I didn't want to take them through the court procedure and take them through that pain. So I was patient, because I recognised that at some point they might want to see me. I saw them only last month, and it was great to see them again. It's amazing how quickly they grow up in a space of 5 years. And I felt really happy. And now I've got my daughter Christina. She's just turned 9 going on 19. And I suppose the difference between my daughter now and the other children is that I've been very fortunate that I'm still able to do the stuff that I love doing, imparting the skills and knowledge that I have to help others, but also to be able to go and do the school run, to stand with the mums, and to be the older dad picking up his daughter, and spending really quality time with her. And I found that relationship with her is really quite special. When I was involved in evacuating staff from Afghanistan, it's probably the most difficult thing I've ever dealt with in terms of stress, because it was really stressful. And we had worked really hard. We were working with the Holy See, working with the US military, to get Afghans inside Kabul airport, to get them on a flight. And it was a really difficult time because Taliban were everywhere, and you're thinking, oh, this is really dicey. And eventually managed to get a number of families, 10 families, inside Kabul airport, and got them on a military flight out. And this was at the height of the crisis. And I did that, and I came out, and the next day, Christina started primary one. So of course we go off to school, and we're looking quite smart, and we're in line. She's got her brand new uniform on, and she's looking really smart. And you do the photograph, welcome to P1. We did all these things, and we're in the line, and usual thing from other parents. One of the mums said to my wife, "Oh, what do you do?" And Katerina says, "Well, I work for the National Trust for Scotland. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, so I look after castles, places of heritage, and the mountains, because we look after Glencoe." what does your husband do? Oh, he just moves them. I thought, well, what a cracking answer. And then Christina went off and did P1, and of course I came back, and we're still in the midst of dealing with Afghanistan. And then we were able to persuade the Americans to allow us to get more Afghans inside Kabul airport. And it was a really difficult point because it was, as you know from the news media, it was crammed in terms of trying to get people in. And I knew exactly what to do because your police training had given you all that sort of insight in terms of the tactics that are used to move people. And we're very fortunate on the last day we were able to get another 65 in at Abbey Gate at Kabul airport before the suicide bombing happened, and the people the US service personnel that had helped us, a lot of them lost their lives, and got them in a plane, and they all flew out. And I came out of that. I cried. Never cried in 30 years of policing because of the pressure. And then Christina very calmly said, "Daddy, I want to watch the Minions." So I think, okay, so whatever you want here. So we suddenly go from dealing with something it's almost indescribable in terms of the mayhem to suddenly sitting on the sofa with my daughter cuddled in, sitting watching the Minions.
What was it like, Andy, to just navigate that? Like, as you're describing it, like just chaos,
Yeah,
people's lives,
yeah,
tragedy. Because when you mentioned earlier, just that you spent half your career as almost as
yeah,
like as a crisis or hostage negotiator.
yeah.
Just out of interest, you can even go with that specific example, but just in general, what's it like to transition from such intensity of high stakes? I'm assuming
Yeah.
to an ordinary life, if you get me.
I, that's a good question. I don't think I have transitioned
Right.
because I think I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
And
But
for
but
me,
even in the moments, though, like just
yeah,
just that specific moment from get that news, and then with your daughter, and then you're watching the Minions. Like, are you there in your body? Like, are you? How
yeah,
do you
yeah.
navigate that?
It took me till the age of 51 to learn how to meditate. The best
Right.
thing I ever did. Somebody said to me, "Oh, Andy, you need to learn to meditate," and I was like, "No chance." I'm Scottish. I'm a police officer. That's never going to happen. And then they persisted, and I went off and did it. And I did it prior to leaving the police. Best thing I ever did because it allowed me to be present in that moment. It allowed me to really focus on pieces of work to clear out all that noise in your head. Uh, and I found it a really powerful tool. Uh, Working with the Jesuits, working in that humanitarian space, uh, I suppose for me the evacuation of Afghanistan was a defining moment because it was just so chaotic. I looked after families and moved families into Pakistan, looked after them in Pakistan until we got them to different countries. Uh, that was defining because suddenly it's like you're a dad not only for your own children but for all these other families that you're trying to help.
And
Uh,
sorry, Andy, just in that, like, is that almost the level of responsibility or connection that you're feeling, like that you truly feel like a father for a number
yeah,
of other. Wow.
yeah. It's not that's not in the job description.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
not by any shadow means, but there were things that just for me just that that amazement at humanity. I mean, one of the families, one of the ladies, we couldn't actually get inside Kabul airport. We couldn't get her in because she was about to give birth, and she gave birth to her little girl And at that time of absolute chaos, her little baby girl who was born at the roadside was just like a beacon of hope. You're thinking, oh, here's all this death and chaos and everything, but life goes on. Now that little girl and her mum and dad are now in Canada. I keep in touch with them. She's to see pictures of her is just, it makes my heart swell. I've
Wow.
got Afghan children that are named after me, and Andrew's not an Afghan name, and I keep in touch with them, and they come out, say, "Mom, Mr. Brown, you did this for us as well." I was part of a bigger team that was helping to do this, but it's, I felt a huge sense of responsibility because I had the skills and ability to help, and for me, it would have just morally felt wrong just to sit back and do nothing, and being able to give of myself to help guide these others to a better life for me is priceless. Is absolutely priceless.
Well, I'm continuously stunned at just the range of this existence. You mentioned even just the undulations in our lives, like,
Yeah,
like this lawyer mentioning you have good chapters, you have bad chapters. You can look at the world and you can go, Jesus, what sort of state is it in?
yeah,
And you could get lost in that.
yeah,
And I think if we pay close enough attention, though, as well, there's just a stunning amount of humanity that exists
yeah,
still. That story, though, of a lady giving birth by a roadside and that they're living in Canada now, like that's just staggering, isn't it? Like,
yeah,
when you talk about the chaos that would have been occurring, and for a life to come in that moment and to still be living and its heart beating and thriving in somewhere in another part of the world is just
yeah,
utterly remarkable.
yeah. I think for me, I went back to Rome after we did that, and I did my usual Scottish thing. I took a bottle of single malt and sat down with Father David, and I said, let's have a wee chat about this. And we were sitting having a dram, and he said to me, he says, I'm going to ask you a question. He says, do you think the Holy Spirit was involved in what we did? And I said, without a shadow of a doubt, 100%. I said, we were able to achieve something that very few other NGOs were able to achieve. I got a phone call. I was walking down to Tesco's to do the shopping after getting the second lot into Kabul airport and getting them on planes. And I needed to do something that was normal. So my wife said, can you go and get some milk? I said, okay, I'll go and get some milk and bread. Now, walking down to Tesco's, my phone rang. And I thought, okay, here we go. What next? And it was a lady who phoned me up, and she says, you don't know me, Andy. My name's Mel. I work for NATO. And I said, aye, okay, right, very good, aye. She goes, I know. She said, I thought you'd say that. I want you to phone me back. This is the number. This is the extension number. This is who you asked for. So I thought, okay. So I did the shopping. Picked a quieter street to walk back and phoned her. And she says, I want to ask you a question. And she was heavily involved in taking some of the Afghan special forces that had worked with their guys out. And she goes, and pardon for swearing, she goes, how the fuck did you manage to get these people inside the airport and get them on a plane and get them out? And I explained what had happened. She says, that's absolutely fantastic. You've been able to do that. And working with different missions across the world, I suppose I've recognised that governments don't always do the right thing by their people. Governments are not always right. Sometimes there are too many rules put in place to to prevent that humanity from happening. And it's, for me, it goes back to my to my core. What is the right thing to do? And I know that I've done stuff. I've helped staff, and we've navigated, lots of different regulations and laws to be able to do that. And I've always stood very, very firm behind my morals to say, is it the right thing to do? And yeah, you're always going to get people that will chance it and try and take advantage of that. But when you see families who are in abject crisis and you can help, then for me that's something that I've done. I'm very fortunate. It was a question I got asked after we did Afghanistan. One of the staff in Rome said to me, "How do you manage all the stress?" She goes, "How do you manage all that stress?" Because she says, I couldn't do, a fraction of what you did. And I sort of laughed and I said, "Okay," I says, "well, it's maybe three things." I said, "My wife is Greek Cypriot, so I said she's pretty tough, and she keeps me right." And I said, "I need that." I said, I need that strong, loving guidance." So I said, if she sees me doing too much, she basically gets told, "Right, that's enough." And I said, I listen to her. I said, I have a young daughter who grounds me, because once time watching the Minions or whatever it is, and she wants that daddy time, which for me is very, very precious. And the last thing is I usually go to the mountains every single day with the dog. Just in nature, I don't wear earbuds or anything like that. Having worked in the Highlands and Islands, I love that open space where you can watch, you can observe nature, and for me that allows me just to process stuff in my head at a different pace,
Yeah.
or sometimes just switch off completely. It's sometimes my wife will say to me, "What are you thinking about?" I'm thinking, "Nothing, just nothing. There's just nothing there. It's just empty. I'm just having quiet time." And for me, and part of the advances in technology, from your mobile phone nowadays, you can manage a whole lot of things. And I know in different crises, sometimes the staff globally, they've picked up the phone and they've just phoned me, and they go, "Where are you?" I'm so high, and then I'll show you. And I'll usually at the top of a mountain that's blowing a hoolie, and I've managed to find a bit of shelter so I can actually hear them outside of the wind. And I've guided them very calmly. I says, "Right, we're going to do this, bang, bang, bang," and guide them very calmly through stuff, to be able to get through it. And I think it's what the Jesuits call, how do we accompany people? It's that accompaniment of walking with people, being with them, not necessarily physically, but spiritually. How do you walk with them through that crisis and take them out the other side?
Isn't it interesting though, Andy, that while that may be a kind of a question that the Jesuits may ask, that when you talked earlier about your experience in just the community leading, you talked about an experience in Nigeria as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
That it seems to be something that's a natural component of how maybe you see the world as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
I by the way, I just love in this day and age when everyone's got a complicated theory for everything, and various studies, you talk about that grounded nature of
yeah,
just a loving, supportive relationship where
yeah,
you've earned the right, where someone has earned the right to really press you, if necessary, to
mhm,
support you. The grounding relationship of a loving daughter,
yeah,
and then nature. Like I really sense that we've really overcomplicated in a lot of ways
yeah,
what is actually effective.
yeah,
And you mentioned the use of phones there, even just how we can try to measure everything
Yeah.
and all these things. But I think that there's something terribly important about just the significance of those three things in a life,
Yeah.
not to mention even just what you mentioned about the meditation and the capacity for that. There was one moment I wanted to go back to,
Hmm.
and it kind of tied into what you were opening up with in terms of, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life, and how do you how do you help other people essentially,
Hmm.
and finding that even more so in your late 40s. That moment in the church where the priest had said that you led us from the darkness into the light, and you felt you'd been hit by almost, or struck by lightning, I think
Yeah.
you almost said.
Yeah.
What what were you experiencing in that moment? Like what what was occurring for you?
Uh,
Like,
I mean, for me, it's so when I married Katerina, I was brought up Church of Scotland. Okay, she was Greek Orthodox, so I converted to Orthodoxy. Uh, Her father, uh, God rest his soul, uh, said to me, "Would you go to Mount Athos in northern Greece to be with the monks for a week?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And he said, "It's not a holiday. It's not. You don't stay in a hotel. It's very basic." So I went off and did that after completing 30 years in the police. It was the absolute right time to do it. It was perfect timing. I went off and did that. And I remember being in one of the really small monasteries on a cliff top, that the Orthodox monk had built this monastery. A young guy, he had been a maths teacher in Athens, and he'd gone through a really bad divorce and thought, right, I've had enough of this, and went off to be a monk. And he sat there, and I was talking to him in English, and this big Russian guy came in, and he was huge. He was, I'm 6'2", and this guy was massive, and he was quite arrogant in his approach, and he shouted at me. He says, "Oh, where are you from?" And I says, "Well, I'm from Scotland, And I said, "Come on, I feel very fortunate to be here." And then he shouted at me. He says, "Where are you from?" And yeah, I felt a serenity come from the priest, and he just very calmly said, "I'm from paradise. What about you?" And I thought, what a cracking answer. and and for me, that journey in my faith has been really important. Uh, when when I was sat in that church and Father Peter said that to me, I felt this like shiver down my spine. It literally felt like, "Boom, you've been given your calling." And I thought to myself, thinking, "Wait a minute, I've policed in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. I'm just a cop. I'm very fortunate to have the skills that I do have. Uh, and how on earth have I found myself here?" I almost felt surreal. Thinking, why, here's me with my tweed jacket on, sitting in St. Peter's Basilica. And I'm thinking, it always almost felt unreal. But these comments to me and that feeling that I had at that moment in time just felt right. This is what you're supposed to do. Now, Katerina has said to me, and when you work with people, from a faith-based organisation, there are frustrations because they move at a different pace. Working in the police for 30 years, you're very task driven, so everything like is let's do this. And a faith based perspective, it's very different because they will look at things differently, they will move at a different pace. So there can be frustrations with that. And during the times I've been frustrated, Katina said to me, "Well, why not go and work with another NGO?" I said, "Yeah, I could do that." I says, "But they're good people and they're doing good work right across the world in the most difficult of circumstances." And I says, "I feel I can help them." And I says, "For me, it's never about the money. I feel I can contribute." And I suppose the question that that I'm asking myself as you get older, I mean, I turned 60 last year, is how long can I sustain that? And how do I help others do that as I get older? So that's the way that I've always, I suppose, as a leader in the police and as a leader in this world now, it's how do I mentor others who are younger, who have got more energy, to be able to do the same thing, to do that approach, to be able to stand up when things are not right. Because sometimes, there's so many different pressures on us nowadays to say, wait a minute, no, you need to go with the flow. I've never gone with the flow. I've always been told, Andy's his own man, and I'm thinking, yeah, well, I'm okay with that. I don't need to suck up to people, and I don't need to do all that sort of stuff. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do what I'm doing. I still get that buzz from helping people, and there's a whole lot of different stories and scenarios. And every time, I go to Texas every year to teach law enforcement negotiators and give them different perspective. From an extortion involving witchcraft in Africa to kidnap, to be able to deal with demands, and how to guide them through that. And I enjoy doing that because you're still part of that camaraderie of being that police, that what they call that brotherhood. I still feel I can contribute, and for me, it's how do I sustain that? And they've all said to me, "Oh, Andy, you need to write a book. You need to write a book." I said, "Oh, okay, maybe I do, yeah." So that's maybe the next part of the journey is to sit down and to write down some of these lessons. And for me, particularly when I went to Africa, there is that, it almost feels like an ancient wisdom. And I remember talking to some of the tribal elders, and one of the compliments I got was, "Oh, Mr. Brown, you have a deep well of wisdom." And I felt as, I sort of thanked him for that. And I felt as saying, well, yes, it's come from, sometimes a bit of a chaotic life where I maybe haven't got everything right. But for me, when I've met people from that type of world, I've always been recognised of having a good heart and having that good energy. And I think that comes down to not only your upbringing, but it just comes down to who you are. And you're right, we can overcomplicate things. Certainly in the world of negotiation, there are lots and lots and lots of different books on how to do this and how to do this, but it's that human interaction.
Yeah.
It's that interaction between you and another person, right? And you can have all the books in the world, but if you can't listen, you can't engage with that other person, you can't share and make that really strong connection, you ain't going anywhere. It doesn't matter how number of books you've had. And one of the examples, when I was in policing, I was based in Isle of Skye and got called out to a job 2 hours away. And it was a young guy who had just been released from prison. He was standing on a bridge, wanting to throw himself off. He'd come out of prison, wasn't allowed to see his 4-year-old son. His ex-wife was a nightmare. And he was too much for him. And my boss who was a negotiator as well, was trying to engage with this guy. And I drove for 2 hours and eventually got there and got out of the car, got a very short briefing saying, we've been here for 2 hours, there's been nothing. He just hasn't engaged with us at all. We've stopped all the trains because it was over a train line. And he just won't engage. His sister's at the back of the ambulance, she's really upset. And so I spoke to his sister, she just confirmed what had happened. And I went up to we did a handover, and I went up, and it was my turn to go and talk to him. And I said to him, "So my name's Andy." I said, I've come here to try and help." I said, "I understand. I've spoken to your sister. I understand that you're here because you've just come out of jail. Uh, you're not getting to see your 4-year-old son, and you find that really, really difficult." And I sort of paused, didn't look at me, and I just said to him, I said, "I kind of know how that feels." And I get this, "No, you fucking don't." I says, "Yeah, I do." I says, "I'm going through a really acrimonious divorce. I, I says, I'm trying to see my son. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't." I says, "Sometimes I sit in my Land Rover and I says, I bawl my eyes out because I get really, I want to see him, I want to spend time with him as his dad. So I says, I know how important that is." I says, "But you're his dad." And I says, "That's the most important job in the world. It doesn't matter whether you've been in jail, you could have been in space or whatever." I says, "That's your job as his dad, is to love him, to nurture him, to help him grow up. And this is a really shitty point in your life." And I says, "But what's helped me is family." I says, "Family has stood by me, and even though that's been difficult for them, they've stood by me." And I says, "But your sister's at the back of that ambulance, bawling her eyes out because she wants to help you, and you just need her. You just need to allow her to do that." So I said, "Can I make a suggestion?" And he said, "What is it?" I says, "How about you come over and we're going to have a cup of tea and sit down and talk about it?" And he goes, "Okay." Now, I had talked to him for literally 5 minutes, right? I'd driven 2 hours, I talked to him for 5 minutes, and he walked over. My boss is looking at me thinking, "What did you say to him that made him do that?" I said, "I shared a bit of myself. I shared a bit of that vulnerability." And when you share that vulnerability, particularly if it's something emotional, that comes out in your voice and in the pitch and the intonation and how you actually speak. And that is massively powerful because it's authentic. It's not lies, it's truly authentic. And people pick up on that. And it's having that courage, as I said earlier, to share some of that. Because when you make that connection with people, particularly when they're in crisis, you can take them anywhere, and you can guide them to a better place. And for me, that's what it's always been about. Is about being able to help others and about being able to guide them through some really tough times. Because I've been through tough times, as most of us have. But it's how you harness that. It's how you actively listen to people, and it's not about me problem solving. It's about guiding them towards a solution that they find for themselves.
Do you know, there's something about that that I will obviously there's lots in that that I find staggeringly beautiful.
Yeah.
But the subtlety of what you're saying, like this isn't a tactic.
No.
Like he can hear in your voice, or he could hear in your voice that you were really sharing something of yourself.
Yeah.
And there's, when we said about just how we've probably overcomplicated things,
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that we've underrated so much is not like, and we've overrated the idea of trying to provide a solution and tell someone how it's going to be. We've completely underrated the sheer quality or the effect that sharing our humanity with another human being has. And I think sadly we're so starved of that
Yeah.
in life at
Yeah.
the moment. And I mean really doing it, not some performative vulnerability, not some performative sharing of something, where it really comes from us. I think we've got no idea how much comfort or support that offers to another.
Yeah.
And I think that's abundantly clear in what you're saying
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
You know, just in terms of just how you like. did this listening or this idea of listening, did this come to you through training? Did this come to you through experience? Because you've touched on it so many times, the significance of showing up to big moments,
Yeah.
and listening was your initial inclination.
So part of it is training. So the active listening and the training you get as a negotiator. So that helps to enhance, I think, what's already there. I'm as a person, I'm quiet by nature, so I'm probably a little bit introverted. Uh, and I'm calm by nature. So I know that, even when I was coaching a guy who was a really good salesman, right? And he would drive home after a day's work, and he would sit in his car for half an hour, so he could calm down before he went inside his house. And I'm going, wow, right? At a weekend, he would run 35 miles in the hills just to burn off his tension. Okay. So I sat down with him and said, right. I said, here's a children's book called The Gruffalo. I want you to read me The Gruffalo. And he looked at me thinking, okay, you're mad, like. And he read it cover to cover in a minute. I went, wow. So I said, is that how you? So he's, similar to me. He'd been through a divorce. He was married to a lady who was Italian, and this was his new daughter. And he said, yeah, that's how I read the book. That's okay. I says, but you're not really using your voice. I said, your voice is a massively powerful tool. I said, we need to use it properly. So I said, let's read the book again, but you're going to take 5 minutes to do it. And he goes, that's really difficult. I says, no, you need to paint a picture inside her head of the Gruffalo walking through the wood and all these different interactions the Gruffalo has. So we did it in 5 minutes, but again, it was a bit too quick. I said, right, now we're going to do it, and we're going to take 10 minutes to do it. And even in that session that I had with him, it clicked for him. It clicked, and he went home, and he was telling his daughter stories, different stories, but was doing it properly. He was using his voice properly. And I remember one of the sessions we did. I said to him, I said, right, come on, let's go for a walk. And we walked away up the hill with the dog, and got to the top, and we just sat down. And I just sat, and I'm quiet. I like nature. I just like watching it, and just feeling it and listening to it. And he sort of said to me, he says, Andy, he says, I've really benefited from doing this. He said, because sitting next to you, you have this serenity where you're really, really calm. And he says, I find it helps me to be calm. And I says, well, I can't be with you all the time. I said, you've got to be able to learn to take these lessons and how you then use that in your life. And I think we overcomplicate things. We're bombarded by so much information nowadays. And for me, it's probably the lessons that go back to my early days working in the islands, where you don't have the resources. You literally don't have the resources. You've got to work with the community. Everybody's got a whole lot of different skills. So, but it's how do you bring these skills together to help each other? And I know having worked in communities, when we've had really bad, storms on the west coast that have wiped out the power and all these various other things. For me, seeing that humanity of looking after our neighbour,
Yeah.
right, going from house to house to make sure. I mean, I used to do it in the winter time, with the Land Rover, going from house to house to make sure, the elderly lady who lived by herself had milk and bread and she had enough wood for the fire. And for me, that's just the right thing to do. And it's and COVID to a large extent probably exacerbated this isolation where we just stay by ourselves, and and have almost lost that ability to be interconnected with communities. Uh, and I know even when I go to the Highlands now, I mean, I live in Edinburgh now, but even when I go to the Highlands, I'm there for a couple of days and I'll be walking down the street and I'll meet somebody that knows me, you know, and it's because of these relationships you build up. And for me, it's if you come into somebody's life and you touch their life, that's for a reason, and then you move on. But that when you touch that person's life, it's for me, it should always try and be positive. Even if their life is in chaos, that interaction should try and be positive. And it's if you actively listen to people, you can hear in their voice sometimes the pain, sometimes the suffering. And one of I suppose the tricks that we use is we would label that emotion. You would say to somebody, okay, you sound sad or you sound frustrated, and we might not always get that right, but invariably the person will tell us, well, no, I'm not frustrated, I'm just really hacked off. And so, well, what's hacking you off? And it's for me, it's sometimes when I teach people negotiation, I put up two pictures. I put a tower up, picture of a tower, which you go from bottom to top as a linear process, which a lot of people think a negotiation is. And I put a picture of a tree. And so for me, a negotiation is more like a tree. I says your strategy is to go up the trunk of the tree to get to the top. But in a conversation and dialogue, you're going to branch out. And we know that if we branch out, what do you normally get at the end of a branch? You normally get the fruit. So for me, it's when you branch out and you really dig deep with someone in that connection, people share stuff with you that's really, really important. And the skill of a negotiator is taking that really deep information to build that connection. And the skill is then taking it back to the trunk of the tree to continue to influence their behavior so that you can guide them through that difficult point in their life.
You know, Andy, through the course of this conversation, even just the idea of finding purpose at this point in your life, but always feeling clearly it always being an idea of contributing to other people, being in your early days in policing in the Highlands or in the islands, just it being community led. I love even just how you talk about nature. There seems to be so much observation
Yeah,
and connecting to, and just this noticing in life, even if it is very task orientated
yeah,
or there's pressure situations, the opening up of listening, being present. Then I think even just paying attention to life's feedbacks, like these big moments in the church,
yeah, yeah,
then just these beautiful notions of just the deepest humanity and some of the deepest pain that people are experiencing. And then even in just this gorgeous recounting of this experience this lady had of giving birth by the side of the road
yeah,
by Kabul airport, and then just a life coming from that and the connection that you maintain from there as well. Even the simplicity we're touching on too of, look, well, when that lady asked you, how do you handle all this? Well, you've got a wife who's an incredible support, you've got a daughter, and you've
yeah,
got nature as well.
yeah,
And just the significance of this listening to you and the subtlety of it and the quality of what you're picking up on when you're really listening, and the exchanging of vulnerability or just real life, and
yeah.
acknowledging that it's different chapters. Just really curious to ask you, Andy, the question of what is a good life for you?
Oh, well, I think I mean, it's taken me a long time. I think I've got a good life now. Uh, I get to, I get in my work, I get to help others, and I'm really passionate about that. And I feel blessed that I'm still able to help lots of people. I feel really fortunate that I'm at a dad again, and in my 50s now into my 60s. I get a free bus pass, which is fantastic. Uh, and for me, I think now I've found a bit of that balance where I can still help people, but I can have that loving family. Uh, and when my wife and I, were courting, she said, "What do you want?" I said, "I just want to be able to sit in my chair to have my children at my feet, and to be able to enjoy life. And for me, it's the simplicity. I see that in the different mission work that we do across the world, and sometimes in the world in which we live now, it's we overlay it with so many complexities, and we need materialistic things and all that sort of stuff. For me, it's really simple, and I think I've now found a good life, and I feel very content. That's what the Piper said to us when we got married. He said, "Marriage is about contentment."
Yeah.
And when I meet people that I've been friends with a long time, invariably they say to me, "Andy, you look very content." And I says, "Well, that's because I am."
Andy, look, thank you so much for joining us here on the What is a Good Life podcast. I think there's so many fascinating insights you've shared, experiences, reflections on life. And I thought the answer would be quite simple because it seems like it's been distilled through life, through all its experiences to this point. And look, I really, really enjoyed listening to that today.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks very much for the opportunity to share.